Hey guys, tonight we're talking about life expectancy in the Middle Ages, a time when simply waking up in the morning counted as a personal achievement. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If medieval history had a most misunderstood statistic award, it would go, without competition, to this sentence. People in the Middle Ages only lived to about 30. This line gets repeated so often that it has basically achieved folklore status. It is quoted confidently, dramatically, and almost always incorrectly, usually by someone who has never stopped to ask what an average actually is. Because this number does not mean medieval adults woke up on their 30th birthday, looked in the mirror, and said, "Ah yes, the time has come," before gently collapsing into the nearest ditch. What it actually means is that childhood was an obstacle course designed by fate on a bad day. Life expectancy is an average, not a countdown timer. And medieval averages were absolutely demolished by infant and child mortality. When huge numbers of children die very young, and in the Middle Ages they did, the math becomes deeply unhelpful. The average sinks, even if the adults who survive go on to live fairly long, stubborn lives. Imagine a village where half the children never reach adulthood. The survivors might live into their 50s or 60s, long enough to complain about their joints, criticise the youth, and insist things were better back in my day. But the average still looks grim, because the early deaths pull the number down like an anchor tied to a sinking boat. This is why medieval life expectancy looks horrifying on paper. Birth itself was risky. Infancy was dangerous. Childhood was a long series of chances to get unlucky. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no germ theory, and no one saying, "Maybe don't drink that." A fever was not a minor inconvenience. It was a negotiation. A small cut was not an annoyance. It was a potential career-ending injury for your entire life. The medieval world was not filled with weak adults. It was filled with adults who had already survived the hardest part. Those who made it past childhood were not fragile. They were battle-tested. So that famous number does tell us something important. Just not what people think. It tells us the Middle Ages were not a world of short lives. They were a world where survival was front-loaded, uneven, and deeply unfair. Which, frankly, is a very medieval way to do statistics. If medieval life expectancy was a numbers problem, birth was where the math immediately tried to kill you. Being born in the Middle Ages was not a gentle entrance into the world. It was a high-risk event involving pain, uncertainty, and a complete lack of anyone who actually knew what they were doing. Childbirth was dangerous for everyone involved. Mothers faced labour without anaesthesia, without antiseptics, and without the comforting presence of someone who understood infections. Midwives relied on experience, prayer, and a collection of herbal remedies that ranged from helpful to, "This might make things worse, but we are committed now." There were no hospitals in the modern sense. No emergency surgery, no sterile instruments. If complications arose, the solution was often spiritual encouragement and hoping the situation respected good intentions. And the baby? The baby entered a world that immediately tested its commitment to staying alive. Exposure to cold, poor nutrition, and disease began almost instantly. Even the first few days were critical. Many infants did not survive long enough to be formally named, not because parents did not care, but because naming someone who might not survive the week was emotionally expensive. Birth records from the Middle Ages reflect this harsh reality. Baptisms were sometimes rushed, not out of panic, out of experience. People knew the odds. They lived with them. Mothers who survived childbirth were not automatically safe either. Infection, hemorrhage, and complications could end lives days later, long after the baby had arrived and everyone thought the danger had passed. Survival required luck layered on top of resilience. What makes this especially grim is repetition. Women did not face this risk once. They faced it again and again. Multiple pregnancies were common. Each one was another roll of the dice, another conversation with fate that no one asked to have. And yet, people kept having children, not because they were careless, but because survival depended on it. High mortality required high birth rates. Families adapted, even when adaptation meant living with constant uncertainty. Medieval people did not assume birth meant life. They hoped for it. Carefully, quietly, and with the emotional restraint of people who had learned that optimism needed limits. Birth in the Middle Ages was not the beginning of safety. It was the beginning of a long negotiation. If you survived birth in the Middle Ages, congratulations. You had officially cleared the tutorial. Unfortunately, the real game started immediately afterward, and it was significantly harder. Childhood was not a protected, innocent phase of life. It was the most statistically dangerous period you would ever experience, and it showed absolutely no mercy. Medieval children faced dangers everywhere. Disease was constant. Hygiene existed, but without any understanding of why it mattered. Germs were invisible, mysterious, and apparently very committed to their work. A simple fever could spiral into something fatal, and no one knew when it crossed that line. Doctors did not measure symptoms. They guessed confidently. Accidents were another favourite threat. Children worked early. They played near animals, tools, open fires, rivers, wells, and carts with no safety standards whatsoever. Falling into something was not a rare mishap. It was a common childhood milestone. And without modern medical care, injuries that seem minor today could quietly end a life. Nutrition didn't help. Many children lived on diets heavy in grains and light in variety. In good years, this was manageable. In bad years, it weakened bodies and lowered resistance to illness. Hunger made everything worse, including survival. Parents knew this. They watched children grow with a mixture of love and restraint. Every milestone was celebrated quietly, cautiously, as if joy itself might attract bad luck. The longer a child lived, the better their chances became, but no one ever fully relaxed. This is where modern misunderstandings begin. We imagine medieval childhood as emotionally cold. It was not. It was emotionally careful. Loving deeply while expecting loss was a survival strategy. People learned to hope in measured doses, and yet, despite everything, many children did survive. Those who made it past the most dangerous early years grew stronger, tougher, and remarkably resilient. By adolescence, survival odds improved significantly. At that point, you had beaten the hardest level without even realizing it. Childhood in the Middle Ages was not short because people didn't value children. It was short because the world did not care. If you reached adulthood, you didn't just grow up. You earned it. There is a stubborn myth that medieval parents didn't love their children because so many of them died. The logic usually goes like this. If loss was common, attachment must have been weak. This idea sounds neat, emotionally tidy, and completely wrong. Medieval parents loved their children intensely. We know this from letters, wills, prayers, church records, and graves. Parents mourned deeply. They grieved publicly and privately. They wrote about their children. They paid for memorials when they could afford them. They did not shrug and move on like emotionally distant robots made of straw and theology. What medieval parents practiced was not emotional detachment, it was emotional management. When death is common, you do not stop loving. You stop assuming. You learn to love while holding back just enough to survive the grief if the worst happens. This wasn't coldness. It was experience. Parents celebrated milestones carefully. A child's first year mattered. Reaching early childhood mattered. Surviving winter mattered. Each stage unlocked a little more relief, a little more hope. Naming ceremonies were sometimes delayed, not because parents were indifferent, but because naming someone who might not survive the month was emotionally expensive. It was grief budgeting. You can see this caution everywhere. Parents prayed obsessively. They used charms. They followed folk remedies. They tried everything available, even when those options ranged from mildly helpful to deeply questionable. This wasn't ignorance. It was desperation mixed with love. And when children died, parents did not respond with stoicism. They responded with mourning that looks painfully familiar to us. Tears, prayers, guilt, anger, and silence appear repeatedly in medieval records. Loss hurt then just as much as it hurts now. The difference was frequency, not feeling. Ironically, this myth exists because medieval parents adapted so well. They functioned despite loss. They continued working, raising families, and living. Modern observers mistake resilience for indifference. But resilience is not the absence of love. It is what love looks like when it has no choice but to continue. Medieval parents loved their children fully, just without the luxury of assuming a happy ending. Here's the plot twist most people never hear. If you survived childhood in the Middle Ages, your life expectancy quietly improved. Dramatically. Not magically. This was still the Middle Ages. But enough to completely reframe that infamous "people only live to 30" line. Once you made it past infancy, early childhood, and adolescence, you had already cleared the most dangerous phase of medieval life. At that point, you were no longer constantly rolling the dice against nature. You were still playing the game, but the odds had stopped being openly hostile. Many medieval adults lived into their 50s. Quite a few reached their 60s. Some even reached their 70s, at which point the village collectively decided you were either blessed, cursed, or secretly immortal. Old age wasn't common, but it absolutely existed, and when it did, it came with authority. Elders were respected, consulted, and occasionally blamed for everything that went wrong, which is still how old age works today. This is where modern misunderstandings really collapse. Medieval society was not a place where everyone died young. It was a place where many died young, and the survivors often lived surprisingly long lives. Life expectancy statistics hide that distinction, flattening complex human experiences into a single misleading number. Once adulthood was reached, people settled into rhythms. They worked, married, raised families, complained about aches, and developed strong opinions about how lazy the younger generation had become. In other words, adulthood looked familiar, just with fewer safety nets and more medieval consequences. This doesn't mean life suddenly became safe.